In the second half of tonight's class, we are going to look at a brief history of photography, of how the medium is driven by the technology, and how photographers respond to different limitations that are put on them throughout time, and how this reflects on the types of photographs that you are going to be creating. And I call this seeing a photograph. So we start with Eugene Auger, who was early 1900s, one of the first really prominent European photographers. In 1910, photography was as a medium probably about 50 years old, as a really practical medium that anybody could practice, maybe 20 years old. So still relatively new as a medium. Now, Auger was a painter, and he became interested in photography. And it wasn't so he could be a photographer. He referred to what he did as creating documents for artists. So he thought he could photograph a scene and then sell these pictures of the scene, and then people could paint from them. So his style of photography was really interesting. He did a lot of Paris street scenes, and because of the type of camera he was using, by default the photographs were kind of like a still life. All right, they were still and relatively devoid of people, because it was a heavy box camera, individual sheets of film that you had to load into the camera. The camera sat on a big heavy tripod, and then you had to focus it, and taking a photograph under these situations could take several minutes. And so if there was a cat on the floor, on the ground there in front of one of the doors, by the time you got your camera prepared and ready to photograph, the cat was gone. And so a lot of Auger's photographs are devoid of animate objects. He also had this really unusual style of composition, where he liked to photograph at these sort of oblique angles. In this previous photograph, he's like square against this scene, and so you're looking at this far wall, and the other walls are coming in around us. But that was unusual for Auger. This was more typical of his work. So he's got this kind of oblique angle, and we're getting the reflections off of the glass of this dress shop, and you can see the buildings in the background, and so we're getting this transmission and reflection of the scene. What Auger was able to do by creating these photographs was something really important, though. He was photographing Paris at a time when the city was changing. A lot of the old Paris was being knocked down and a new Paris was being built. And his photographs, they were a document for sure, but they were a document of the sea change that was happening in this vibrant city. And so his photographs became really important as they translated through time. And they're a fascinating look at the architecture and the pastimes, the things that people spent their time with and their money on, where they lived, how they lived, the Paris parks. You know, looks like early in the spring. Isn't that beautiful? These beautiful roses. Isn't that gorgeous? This is one of the few photographs that has actual peopleage in it. And you notice the reason he can photograph this gentleman who's got this little pull cart is that he's squatting down. He's not moving. So he was able to hold still. And it might have been a couple second exposure. It was probably a relatively long exposure by our standards. But he's crouched down and he's not moving, so he's not, for that reason, not a blur. And you see a little boy in the background too, who is kind of a blur on the left-hand side. So the photographs, I mean, they serve an important purpose. And there's these very evocative, meditative sort of photographs, and it had to do with the fact that the technology that Auger had to work with kind of drove the type of photographs he was able to get. With a big bulky box camera that you have to put on a tripod and load an individual sheet of film in and focus, and then pull a dark slide, make your exposure, put the dark slide back in, pull the film out. You know, you can't photograph the races with that kind of camera. It's just something that technically you just cannot accomplish. So as a result, these are the kinds of photographs that Auger created. And they're still memorable to this day. They're still important photographs, and they're beautiful prints. They're really well made prints. They're dark, they're rich. You can see detail. If I can zoom in on this here, you can see, you know, beautiful detail down in this dark wall, and even in the apothecary here. It's almost a liquor shop and a cafe. You can see the detail on the door and the window and the bottles in the window. You can even see the texture of the street itself. Beautiful, just beautiful prints. So Tina Modotti is a real interesting person. She began her professional career as an actress. She moved from Italy to Hollywood, California in the 1920s to become a silent film actress, and did some work in the film industry, but got a job as an assistant for a photographer named Edward Weston, who we will look at in great detail. And so Modotti modeled for Weston for a while, and then became his photographic assistant. This is one of the photographs that Weston took of Tina as a model. But she and Weston became very close, became a couple. And the two of them traveled to Mexico quite often. And the Mexican Revolution was just beginning to foment at the period they were down there. And Modotti became very interested in the communist movement and the Revolution, because it reminded her of stuff that had happened, was occurring in Italy. And so she was kind of simpatico with what she saw in her travels to Mexico. Her early photographs are these beautiful, they're photographs of geometry is the best way I can explain them. They're really strong composition. There's this light and shadow, repetition of form, this movement from right to left. It's like this big sweeping arc that takes you from the lower right-hand corner to the upper left-hand corner. It moves you in and through the photograph, and it's just a remarkable architecture in this photo. This one is actually one of my all-time favorite photographs of all time. It's a really simple photo. The staircase, the wooden case, but it's the the repetition, the movement, you start where the photograph starts, where we are as the viewer, standing at the top of the stairs, and then moves down and goes to the left and down. But then the movement of the railing at the top kind of catches our attention and pulls us from the top back down to the left-hand corner, back into the photograph, and then we have this composition that keeps moving in a counterclockwise direction. Texture, the architecture, it's just a gorgeous print. It's a beautiful photograph, simple, clean. One of the things that photography does best, these kinds of descriptions of things. This photo of her bed, it's one of the things you study as a painter, is learning how to paint fabrics and light and shadow, and it's important in photography that you learn how to depict light and shadow. But the beauty of this, look at the folds in the fabric and how these move back and forth, and how it goes from light to dark, and even off in this corner that appears so dark, there's texture and there's still movement, and then in the light areas there's still, look at that beautiful movement of the sheet, and the hairpins then, which provide this sort of stark contrast in terms of shape and movement. It's a beautiful study of light and shadow. Well, Dottie's work, as it progressed, as she became a photographer unto her own, really did pick up this graphic quality to it. All right, almost like they were drawings, they were photographic drawings. And then she moved into this real strong kind of graphic design element that gave her an outlet for her political aspirations. The hammer and sickle, the symbol of the communist revolution, and on the Mexican sombrero. A simple still life, but a really strong, politically really strong message photograph. The Mexican farmers reading the El Machete. I believe it was a communist newspaper. And it's great because you see the figures all around. Their straw hats are kind of shading them and in the paper. And then up in this upper right-hand corner, there's just one face that peeks out at us. Isn't that something? And it was startling for me when I first saw that face, because it felt like I was intruding. As soon as I saw that face, I thought, oh, I shouldn't be looking at this. This is a private, like a private moment. And I always found it really interesting that those eyes looking back at me were very startling and very disturbing. Not the right word, but and the men all moving through town with their straw sombreros. This photograph really shows kind of like it starts to show the power of the worker, the workers' rights, the hand on the shovel, the people who build, the people who create, the peasant people, the farmers, the builders, the construction people. And this was a photograph of somebody working a marionette. And so she's got a photograph of her of the hands and all the strings and the marionette. Very political photograph. The hands being the government and the government pulling the strings of the people. So Modotti takes the idea of these photographs and puts a really strong political stamp on them. And it shows another aspect of photography that becomes really important as we move on. And then Minor White. We'll go back and look at Minor White in detail. I think he's I mean, these are all important photographers. Minor White, we're getting into anywhere from the 1950s through the 1970s. Minor White was a teacher as well as a photographer. He taught at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He taught at RIT in Rochester. But he spent most of his time in California, on the San Francisco School of Art, and had this little tribe of students who worked with him. And working with Minor White was probably shy of being a commune. That he was a very, very, very spiritual person, a very philosophical, metaphysical understanding of life. He was a Buddhist. He was a meditator, practiced yoga, and this is stuff that was not common in America in this time period. And very often, what would happen is everybody would get together in the morning, and they would have this big communal breakfast, and you might have 10 or 20 people together, and they'd all have breakfast together. White would talk about what the day would unfold. He was either going to teach a lesson or he's going to send them out on an assignment, talk about their day, what they're going to do. And then everybody would head out and create their photographs. And they'd shoot their pictures, and they would come back middle of the day, develop their film, and prepare dinner. So they developed their film. While their film was drying, they would prepare their dinner, have dinner, and they would go get their film. Everybody would go to their darkroom spot, and they would print all night. And then they would come together later in the evening, and they would lay the prints out, and they would critique till 1 or 2 in the morning. Put everything away, get up the next morning, and do it again. So working with Minor White was this practice in Buddhist philosophy of not going too far in one direction or too far in another direction, trying to find a middle path, looking at the meditative quality of photographs, looking at the metaphysical messages that photographs had to say. And as a result, he spawned an entire generation of philosophically driven photographers. And so Minor White, among other people, taught Diane Bush and taught Terry Lindquist. And Diane Bush and Terry Lindquist, and among other people, taught me. And then I am teaching, among other people, you. And so you're really just kind of third in a line from Minor White. And my philosophy toward teaching is based really firmly in Minor White's understanding of photography. That it's about your focus on what you are pursuing, and pursuing it for a variety of reasons, but always paying attention to the quality of your technique, simplicity in approach, honesty in what you're trying to accomplish with your photographs, and in many ways traditionalism towards the photograph and different genre, still life, landscape. All right, so it may be a admittedly old school approach towards education, but it's one that I've always found produces, I think, pretty spectacular results. One of my favorite Minor White photographs Oddly enough, this is entitled Peeled Paint. And it is a picture of peeled paint. And I used to visit Terry Lindquist. He taught at Fredonia. And I got my graduate degree in 1993. And I spent a lot of time at Fredonia and spent a lot of time with Terry. Um, and the first time he invited me over to his house, this photograph was hanging on the wall. It was 5x7, so photograph was like this big. And it was a contact print. It was a print from a 5x7 negative, a 5x7 print negative, put right down on the paper and then printed. So there was no enlargement. It was the same size as the negative. Framed very simply in a white mat and a white frame. And it was the most stunning thing I had ever seen in my life. And when you look closely at the photograph, you go past the graphic nature of what you're looking at, and you start to see the detail inside it. The texture of the surface that the paint is peeling off of, that's white, but not so white that we can't see that texture. The paint itself, we can see how the texture on the back of the paint relates to the texture that it's peeling away from. The beautiful like curls and folds in that paint. And even the dark edge over here, which at first blush appears to be without any texture at all. But you can see almost like stars in a dark sky as you work through this. Just an absolutely stunning photograph. And a simple subject, peeled paint. So the photographers, as they move through, their technology sort of drives what they're doing. All of these photographers are really working with those box cameras, and so they have a focus that's on stillness, on direct approach, and on picking this subject and creating a straightforward message out of this single image.